Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, desolate search, peasants, vassals, minions, Zionists, bootlickers. Oh, I said that. How about Zionist bootlickers? I haven't said that. I'm a Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to go back to Israel on a very important evening because the Israeli elections are in progress. And in fact, Netanyahu's party, the Likud party, is tied. But what I want to talk about today is a very important topic that's related to this election, specifically because Benjamin Netanyahu has made some statements recently that make this idea of a two-state solution come full circle. Because Mr. Netanyahu has played this charade for years to appease the United States, and for strategic reasons acted like he wanted to have a two-state solution, a Palestinian state. Of course, that's been a lie all along. And not only has it been a lie all along through Netanyahu's reign, but it's been a lie all along throughout Israel's entire history. And so that's what I want to talk about. Specifically, the contemporary events, of course, we have Netanyahu on Sunday saying that the Likud party have now decided that the Palestinian state is, quote, irrelevant, unquote, and that Israel will not cede any territory due to the current climate change in the Middle East, and that any land they give to create a Palestinian state would just be a launching ground for Islamic extremists, which of course is a hyperbole, exaggeration, and a distortion. But that's what we've come to expect from Netanyahu, so it's right in line with everything else he says. So now by Monday he says he knew that his chances were decreasing somewhat, so he pledged that there will be no Palestinian state. If he's elected, there will be no Palestinian state, and that's what I mean. That is the culmination of the entire history of Israel coming to a head now with yet Netanyahu's statement. And I found it interesting, actually, that his opposition, Isaac Herzl from the Zionist Union Party, said that, quote, whoever wants hope, change, and a better future, unquote, should vote for him. And I hope the Israelis don't fall for that hope and change mantra like they did here in the United States. But anyway, now in the 11th hour, Netanyahu actually came out and said that his re-election may fail because, quote, Arab voters are coming out in droves, unquote. So just like we would expect from such a narcissistic, maniacal bootlicker like Bibi Netanyahu, will blame it on everyone but himself and his policies. But let me get back to the actual subject of the video, which is there has never been a two-state solution. There's never been any real push to create a Palestinian state. And these are the reasons why. And one of the reasons why we know that there will never be a Palestinian state is because this fraud is maintained for the benefit of three main players. And this fraud is maintained by the Palestinian Authority because they use it to sustain their bureaucracy and to continue to get support and expenses, even though they know Israel will never allow them to have a separate state. So they keep that dream alive for their own purposes. And then we also have Israel, who use it to sustain their mythology of diplomacy and negotiation. And they use this front of diplomacy and negotiation to continue confiscation of land and building settlements. And let's be clear that any alternatives or treaties would stop this process, and that's why there's no true negotiation and no compromise and no alternatives ever considered by Israel, because they don't want to stop this process of confiscation and building of settlements. And that's the bottom line about the charade of the two-state solution. And for the U.S., the third party that benefits or is a player in this, the U.S. uses it to look like it is doing something as it is strung along by Israel's fraud. And that's basically how that works. And the history also bears out that there will be no two-state solution, because if you go all the way back to 1937, the Peel Commission already proposed splitting the country and splitting Palestine. And in 1948, there was a UN partition plan. And once again, these proposals all fail due to what would reasonably expect to be logic. For example, in 1948, of course, the Palestinians rejected the UN partition plan because they were given a significantly small portion of a country that was once theirs by a much smaller population, getting a much larger part. So for those out there who spread this propaganda about, oh, all these negotiations failed because Hamas keeps rejecting, and let's remember Hamas didn't even exist in a lot of these previous negotiations, but saying, oh, it's the Palestinians who have rejected all these proposals, and it simply is not true. It's usually a more unreasonable demands by Israel, and generally they keep continuing to adjust what the PowerPoints are of what Israel wants to make it so that their demands could never be met, or it would be a complete lack of dignity for the Palestinians to accept it. So anyway, and then in 2002, of course, we had the Arabs League backing a two-state solution, and this is 10 years after the 1993 Oslo Accord. So we have a number of major milestones in this charade about this two-state solution, and that's part of the proof too. When you go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years of these negotiations and they can't get it done, that shows that the strategy isn't to succeed in creating a two-state solution. It's to work around it and to use it for the Israeli agenda. The negotiation issues actually are fairly simple too. They're about borders, they're about security, they're about settlements, they're about the status of Jerusalem, they're about refugees, they're about water rights. All fairly straightforward things to work out. But once again, considering Israel's strategy, which I'll go into in a little bit more, that's the reason why these are all catching points in creating a two-state solution. So to go on further about what the evidence is in this fact that it's a charade that there is any serious consideration of a two-state solution, one is the systematic and strategic building of settlements and infrastructure. Israel has very carefully designed their settlements in order to envelop and create these isolated enclaves. So the Palestinian neighborhoods that are left behind continue to be more and more isolated. And they use the infrastructure in order to make sure that there's no possibility in the future that the land could be redivided up in any other way due to the way the infrastructure is set up. So a very clear indication of what Israeli strategy is. Number two, the evidence, Israel's made it clear they will never, ever, ever return to 1967 borders, and they are very, very slowly absorbing Jerusalem and West Bank with the continued spread of these settlements. Number three in evidence is Israel relies on and instigates a cycle of perpetual conflict, a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. So, in other words, they want these wars to keep going on. So they incite resistance by the Palestinians, and then they react with overwhelming force. And then they use the example of Hamas resistance to Israeli occupation to say, oh, see, here's this cycle of violence. And so it just continues on and on. And they use this cycle of violence to continue to deny and punish the Palestinians, and to continue to deny them the state based on that same perpetual cycle of violence. And it goes on and on while they continue to confiscate more land and build more settlements. We also, evidence number three, the Palestinians have become completely marginalized and actually interned. And 70% of them live in poverty, and they live off in these walled off neighborhoods and these the walled off open air prison that Gaza is. And so the idea that it could even be a one state with a substantial Palestinian population is not even in the Israeli plan. The Israeli plan is to create an apartheid state with Palestinian enclaves, with Israel basically confiscating all the land in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Number 5, and as far as evidence, 75% of Israeli Jews oppose this two-state solution. That's pretty good evidence, not to mention the fact that 93% of Israeli Jews supported the attack on Gaza, and I'm sure the percentage for the other Gaza attacks was high as well. So pretty much the population of Israel, for the most part, is on board with not having a two-state solution. One of the reasons why Netanyahu could feel free to make such an audacious promise. Number 6, Israel knows it has a free pass from the U.S. and acts with impunity. It doesn't matter how many times they're censored or condemned by the UN. They don't care. They have the U.S. in their pocket, and therefore they really don't have to answer to anyone and can act with impunity. Number 7, Israeli punishment for any Palestinian acts. Another evidence of no two-state solution. Every time they push the Palestinians and the Palestinians react, then the Israelis use it as an excuse to punish them again in various means. And so certainly one of them is to not deny any hope for a future Palestinian state. And then lastly, at number 8, as far as evidence, 25 to 30 years of peace negotiations that have resulted in nothing. And that's the best evidence of all that there will never be a two-state solution. Another way to go about showing that there has never been a serious consideration of a two-state solution and creating a new Palestinian state is the words of numerous prominent Zionists themselves, who've spelled it out for anybody that wants to listen, that over all these years there's never been really any serious consideration that there would be an Israeli state side by side with a Palestinian state. And we can go back to, for example, 1895 in the diary entry of Theodore Herzl. He said, quote, "We will spirit the penniless Palestinian population across the frontier by denying it employment in our new country. Both the process of expropriation and removal must be carried out discreetly," unquote. And so that's 50 years before even the state of Israel was created, and they already knew what they were going to do with it. And I can still hold this up and use it as an example historically because that same agenda is obviously in place. And as you go through the years, the quotes have a remarkable similarity. Jewish essayist Akkad Ha'am visited Palestine in 1891, and he said, quote, "Abroad, we are accustomed to believe that Israel is almost empty and that nothing is grown there, and that whoever wishes to buy land can come there and easily do so. In reality, it is difficult to find land that isn't already cultivated," unquote. So much for the propaganda that a lot of Zionists and neocons like to spread around, that there was nothing there yet, and that Israel just moved into a barren wasteland where nobody lived and nobody was doing anything with the land. But once again, you're going all the way back 50 years before Israel was created, and we already have the idea that Israel and Palestine would not be side by states, as that everybody in Israel, everybody in Palestine would be expelled, and Israel would be one state for only Jews. And then we have Joseph Weitz, the head of the Jewish Agency's colonization department in 1940. And he said, quote, "Between ourselves, it must be clear that there is no room for both peoples together in this country. We shall not achieve our goal if the Arabs are in this small country. There is no other way than to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left," unquote. And to jump forward, so we have that quote from nearly 70 years ago, or over 70 years ago. And then we have somebody like Moshe Feiglin, who recently said his view of what should happen in Gaza. He said we should start with an ultimatum, one warning to Gaza, and tell them that Sinai is not so far and that they should leave. And then the second step would be the attack, where the Israeli army would use maximum force against all targets with no considerations. Then his third step is siege, total siege of Gaza. All civilians must go. And then defense. Obviously, any attacks on Israeli army will be attacked with full force. Conquer. After softening targets, all Gaza would be conquered. Elimination. The enemy population would be allowed to leave. Israel will generously aid those who want to leave. And sovereignty. And there's the bottom line. According to Moshe Feiglin, Gaza is part of our land, and it will become part of Israel and populated by Jews. And like I say, let's keep going back through history. Nixon said in his memoirs, quote, "An attitude of total intransience on negotiating any peace agreement that would solve the return of any of the territories they had occupied," unquote. Or how about Israel's economic minister Naftali Bennett, and he's also involved in the Israeli election that's going on right now. He represents the Jewish Home Party, and he favors complete annexation of the West Bank, as do most of the Zionists. And he said that, quote, "Israelis are turning their backs on the two-state solution in the wake of the recent war with Hamas, and it is now time to think about new models instead of an independent Palestinian state," unquote. He goes on to say that, quote, "What we learned is that there's no particular method for preventing missiles being shot at you from a piece of land you handed over to your enemies. The logic that the world will love us if we give up more land doesn't work," unquote. And then we also have a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Lustig, and he says, quote, "The process of a two-state solution has become something of a fraud behind which lies opportunistic political motives. The Palestinians use it to keep aid flowing in to maintain the leadership lifestyles and the tens of thousands of civil servants, police, and bureaucrats. Israel uses it for domestic political gain to shield it from global criticism, and the U.S. uses it for creating the illusion that it is working on a peace process to serve Israel." Lustig believes, unquote, Lustig believes that the two-state solution is, quote, "an impossible hope that has produced only periodic negotiations which have always been phony and have prevented consideration of any other possible new ideas for positive change. All the while, settlements, infrastructure, and restrictive laws expand." Lustig suggests that once the fraud of the two-state solution is exposed, then we will see some real drama in Israel. We will see mass mobilizations, riots, brutality, terror, Jewish and Arab immigration, and rising tides of condemnation. And I see that as very likely. And as a matter of fact, we may end up seeing it sooner than later, the way things are going. Let's go back in history again for some more quotes. We have Israeli Cabinet Minister Mordecai Bentov in 1972. He said, quote, "Israel's entire story about the danger of extermination was invented of whole cloth and exaggerated after the fact to justify the annexation of new Arab territories," unquote. So that also goes in line with just the whole colonial nature of this and the expansion, and that across all of Israel and confiscating all those lands. There will be no Palestine. That's been the goal all along, and that's part of the reason why it's so important now that they declare it a Jewish state. That's part of that process, and this is without going into the whole concept of a greater Israel, which I've covered in another video. So then we also have Moshe Dayan in 1979. Quote, "I know you Americans think you're going to force us out of the West Bank, but we're here and you're in Washington. What will you do if we maintain settlements? Squawk? What will you do if we keep the army there? Send troops?" Unquote. So very defiant. They have a very defiant attitude, condescending attitude to the United States, and well, they should, considering the United States is their water boy. In 1983, the mayor of Tel Aviv said, quote, "We have to kill all the Palestinians unless they are resigned to live here as slaves," unquote. We have Ariel Sharon in 1988 said that, quote, that if the Palestinian uprising continued, Israel would have to make war on her Arab neighbors. The war, he stated, would provide the circumstances for the removal of the entire Palestinian population from the West Bank and Gaza, and even from inside Israel proper, unquote. And then we also have David BenGurion, the first Israeli prime minister. So once again, this is going all the way back to the beginning of the creation of the state of Israel. And he said that, quote, if I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true God promised it to us, but how could that interest them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and we have stolen their country. Why would they accept that? We must do everything to ensure the Palestinians never come back to their homes. The old will die and the young will forget, unquote. And then we also have John Mearsheimer, and he says that, quote, the peace process is a charade. Where is this all headed? You're going to end up with a greater Israel. You already have a greater Israel. It's going to be one state with scattered Palestinian enclaves. This will be an apartheid state. This is where it is headed. How can the international community facilitate this two-state solution? I think that question is largely irrelevant. There's not going to be a two-state solution, unquote. And then lastly, I want to talk about the two things, the Koning Report of 1976, and this caused quite a stir. And this is the sort of thing that the Palestinians are aware of, and most Israelis probably aren't aware of anymore because it's not in their history books, and certainly Americans are not aware of it. But the Koning Report that came out in 1976 was leaked, and it was a blueprint for the settlement expansion and the diluting of Arab populations in order to create a one state, a Jewish state, an Israeli state with no Palestinians. And in this report they said, quote, we must use terror, assassination, intimidation, land confiscation, and cutting off of all services to rid Israel of its entire Arab population, unquote. So once again, you know, when all these people out in the world talk about Hamas and their terrorism and how Israel needs to defend itself, and you see these official documents and these quotes from people high up in the Israeli governments stretching back for the last 75 years, all talking about using terror and assassination, intimidation for the expulsion of all Arabs and Palestinians and the confiscation of all the land and the expansion of these settlements and the acknowledgement that they stole this land. I'm hoping that some more people out there will continue to reevaluate their positions on this, and particularly because you would think of all people, the Jews would understand the plight of the Palestinians, persecuted, expelled, their land confiscated, their wealth confiscated, their families torn apart in war, and a constant struggle to maintain their culture and identity. So the Jews justify creating another diaspora by using their own as an example. And so anyway, there is no two-state solution. There never has been a two-state solution. The plan all along is to steal all the land and expel all the Palestinians. And then the Palestinians can roam the earth like the Jews did, and maybe someday somebody will create them a homeland in their promised land. And just for dramatic effect, I'm going to finish with one last quote with this quote-filled video, because I wanted the Zionists to speak for themselves to prove that there is no two-state solution. And this will really wrap it up nicely. This is from Prime Minister Menachem Begin in a speech to the Knesset, Israel's parliament, in 1982. And he said that, quote, our race is the master race. We are divine gods on this planet. We are as different from the inferior races as they are from insects. In fact, compared to our race, other races are beasts and animals, cattle at best. Other races are considered as human excrement. Our destiny is to rule over the inferior races. Our earthly kingdom will be ruled by our leader with a rod of iron. The masses will lick our feet and serve us as slaves. Unquote. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.